Our next guests are Jennifer Krippner and Dr. William Maples. Dr. William Maples is the founder, president, and chief executive officer of the Institute for Healthcare Excellence, a national organization supporting care redesign and cultural transformation in delivery systems across the United States. Dr. Maples earned his undergraduate, master's in oncology, and medical degrees at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and completed his residency and fellowship in medical oncology at the Mayo Clinic Graduate School of Medicine. Dr. Maples practiced medical oncology for 25 years at the Mayo Clinic and helped lead the Mayo Clinic quality, safety, and experience journey, after which he served as Senior Vice President and Chief Quality Officer at Mission Health in Nashville, North Carolina, where he helped Mission Health navigate cultural transformation and become a top-ranked U.S. health system recognized for its impeccable quality and safety. And with Dr. Maple, we have Jennifer Krippner, who is the Chief Experience Officer for the Institute for Healthcare Excellence. And Jennifer is a graduate from the College of St. Benedict in Minnesota with a bachelor's degree in liberal studies communication. She's a fierce advocate for connecting people, concepts, seen and unseen, that positively move the patient and employee experience forward. Her ability to lead, inspire, manage, and mentor employees, providers, and community made her perfect as the Chief Experience Officer at the Institute for Healthcare Excellence. It's a real privilege to have you both sharing your insights and knowledge and experience with us. Thank you very much. We look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Jose. Jennifer and I are delighted to be with you today to have a conversation about, as you consider the significant transformation that has happened to healthcare over the past decade or longer, and associated with that, the problems with clinician burnout, and then layer on top of that the turbulence from the viral pandemic. How can we actually help our individuals and teams move from emotional exhaustion to thriving, resiliency, and achieving peak performance? That is a daunting responsibility that healthcare leaders, as well as physicians, nurses, and team members, really have the responsibility of solving. As I said, next slide, Jennifer. Joining me today is Jennifer Krippner, our Chief Experience Officer for the Institute for Healthcare Excellence. And our work today has actually been shaped by the National Task Force for Humanity in Healthcare. Next slide, Jennifer. Multiple organizations joined in the effort here to really understand the problem of clinician burnout. Initially, a group of physicians gathered at Wingspread Retreat to not only discuss what contributes to burnout, emotional exhaustion, but also to begin to discuss what are the solutions and the pathways to solve this. Subsequently, a group of nurses gathered at Wingspread and wrestled with the same topics, after which both groups joined together to form the National Task Force for Humanity in Healthcare. Next slide, Jennifer. Our strategic partners in this work for the National Task Force include the American Hospital Association, Vocera Communications, as well as the Institute for Healthcare Excellence. And our executive sponsors are Dr. Ron Paulus, who previously was the CEO of Mission Health System in Asheville, North Carolina, Dr. Bridget Duffy, who is the CMO at Vocera Communications, and myself. Our objectives for today are threefold. Number one is to discuss how do we change the conversation from one focusing on burnout to one focusing on thriving and achieving peak performance. With that is, if we change the conversation, how do we even think about the measurement? Second, what are the solutions that will lead to a change in the work environment that will actually promote professional well-being and peak performance? And third, if you implement these solutions, what types of results can you expect within your healthcare organization at the individual and organizational level? Next slide. So for a moment, as we continue the conversation, I want you to think about your typical day at work. and ask the question, what allows you at the end of the day to go home with a good tired feeling? We're all going to go home tired. We can either go home with a good tired or a bad tired feeling. And I think we've all experienced both of these. Another way to ask this question, what is your greatest source of job satisfaction? I'll give you 5 to 10 seconds to kind of ponder that, and then we'll come back. Next slide, Jennifer. This is a compilation of ideas and thoughts from multiple healthcare organizations about barriers that get in the way of individuals and teams achieving peak performance. As you thought about your own journey, your days when you can go home with that good tired feeling versus a bad tired feeling, I'm sure many similar thoughts came across your mind. Thoughts of, gee, if my team members would only be accountable, if they'd only be engaged, if the processes that we deal with on a daily basis were actually working well rather than draining energy, helping make my day go a bit easier. If leaders would actually help create an environment that helped us succeed and would communicate clearly what the goals and visions were and connect the dots for us. If technology would actually help us rather than make it more difficult for us to do our jobs. And lastly, how do we manage the conflict and the controversies that come up every single day with patients and fellow team members? All of those are critical to really achieving peak performance. Next slide. So in a diagram fashion, the secret to peak performance includes 3 things. First of all, processes that work and are efficient and that amplify the joys of actually practicing medicine every day and minimize the hassles. Second, technology that helps us move our journey forward and helps rather than hinders. And third, one that we often maybe don't pay enough attention to is what is the culture or the work environment that we're trying to execute the incredibly complex things we do as healthcare providers every single day. Next slide. So why is this culture important? And I'd like to share with you some work from Dr. Michael Leonard from Safe and Reliable Healthcare. Dr. Leonard looked at the team culture within different units within the same organization who had the same leadership, the same policies, procedures, etc., and looked at units that had teamwork scores greater than 60 and compared those to units that had teamwork scores less than 60. As you can see, the teamwork culture predicted preventable harm. Units that had higher teamwork scores had fewer medication errors per month. Days between C. diff infections, a serious infection, actually improved 3-fold. Days between stage 3 pressure ulcers improved 3-fold. Also, the experience that patients had on these units improved almost 2-fold. So the culture does matter, and there is a lot at risk in terms of harming our patients, as well as the financial risks associated with these particular harm episodes that if we don't get this right, we're missing many opportunities. Next slide. Dr. Leonard also looked at what happens to the employee outcomes based on the teamwork culture. And you can see that employee satisfaction, actually that translates to employee engagement, doubled in units that had higher teamwork culture. And employee injuries, absenteeism, and nurse vacancy rates significantly improved, vacancy rates 9-fold based on the teamwork climate. So that's why this culture piece actually matters, and there's multiple studies that confirm Dr. Leonard's work. Next slide. Now let's take a look at how we've actually done as a nation in the United States creating this optimal culture. From the patient's perspective, this is the overall rating for Hcap scores over the past 12 years. And there's been billions of dollars and multiple efforts that have been really implemented to try to improve this experience culture. You can see we made some very mild gains and initially, And then over the last 5 years, been quite static. So I think we have to stop and pause and say, what is it that we might be missing as we try to create this optimal experience for the patients that we serve? Next slide. When we look at the experience culture of our physicians, nurses, and caregiver team, we can look at the emotional exhaustion or burnout that the team is experiencing. You can see from 2011 to 2014, on the blue line, the burnout actually was increasing over time, whereas the yellow line shows the burnout for other occupations collectively within the United States and was relatively flat. The good news in this is that from 2014 until present, the burnout has remained relatively flat, however, is staying high in the 40 to 45% range. The consequences of that burnout are not trivial. Patient satisfaction can suffer, but infections go up, medication errors go up, and do patients actually go home or not from healthcare episodes? The standardized mortality rates are adversely affected. So we have to again stop and ask ourselves, how do we actually create that culture that will move from emotional exhaustion to emotional thriving, recovery, resiliency, putting joy back into the practice of medicine? Next slide. This was a meta-analysis that was done by the journal, the JAMA Internal Medicine, reported in JAMA Internal Medicine, and summarized, have really kind of give some sobering sort of conclusions that all of the work that we've done on burnout have really led to small reductions in burnout. However, when the solutions were more organization directed, the results were somewhat more effective. And the conclusion here was that organization-directed approaches that promote healthy individual organization relationships may be a clue to how we can more meaningfully approach this challenge to move from emotional exhaustion to thriving. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer to really share the high-level themes that came out of the National Task Force for Humanity in Healthcare.
Thank you, Dr. Maples, for the great background and setup for really what are the challenges that healthcare organizations and our clients that really face the opportunities that are out there right now. And some of those that came up through the Wingspread retreat and the other retreats that the National Task Force participated in are really the competing demands that really can interfere with the desire to build interpersonal relationships with physicians and with fellow caregivers. And there's also this desire to be caring and thoughtful, and that's really why people came into healthcare. And they found that really became extinguished early in their careers when we're told that there's too many people to see, that there's not enough time to be caring and thoughtful. That was another challenge. Also, when patients present with pain and fear and feeling vulnerable, it kind of is a complicated setup to really create the strong relationships that they desired. The concept of team is ever evolving. And then there's all the regulatory demands, the technology challenges with the EMR, the reimbursement requirements. Those all limit the times available to develop relationships. So those are the themes for the challenges and opportunities that healthcare organizations and physicians and caregivers face. So what are the proposed solutions? This is really where the leaders and caregivers and nurses spent most of their time during the retreat to really think about what can we do? Let's create this plan and a pathway and a blueprint forward. So these next two slides will really speak to what that blueprint is. They had a strong desire to train leaders to lead in a more effective human-centered way, to increase trust between physicians and administrators, and to develop skills that really incorporated appreciation into all of the work that's done. Designing curriculum that puts the patient and physician relationship at the center of the medical training up front. So they begin their career with that relationship at the center of that work. Creating a safe place for patients, respecting patients' choices and being forgiving, and promoting care models that engage patients in their care. In addition to bridging the personal leadership and organizational divide, they really wanted to focus on connectedness, collaboration, promoting resiliency, and really reframing this thought of focusing on treating burnout to what does it look like, what does it feel like to achieve thriving? And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail coming up. Also to collaborate with other healthcare professions to create more of a team-based learning, and then to find ways to support caregivers in meeting not only technical obligations, but doing that without detracting from that patient interaction or that patient relationship. So again, this National Task Force Humanity Blueprint. So how do we start? What are the 4 different types of interventions that we can really focus on creating and connecting to positive emotions that will impact the culture, the thriving, and the well-being that everyone really desired? The first is really, how do we lead differently? What are the skills? What are the necessary skills to lead differently? How do we then look and work with the team to create a positive culture focused on that human connection? And third, how do we focus on our relationships as much as the technical execution in our daily work? And how do we design it differently so that we have that human connection and access to positive emotions? And then fourth, how do we have an intensive focus on empathy, trust, so that those stronger relationships can be at the center of our work? So that's where we start to move forward differently. If we really think about the last 20 years, we started back in the 80s with Christina Maslach and the Burnout Inventory, really focusing on our personal emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, personal accomplishment, all of those things really focused on burnout and what kind of deficit that we're starting at. Through the years, we've kind of transitioned into more of a team-based culture of wellness, personal resilience, and kind of efficiency of practice. And so as we're thinking about more recently with Dr. Brian Sexton, Marcus Buckingham, and the National Task Force for Humanity in Healthcare, in which the Institute for Healthcare Excellence is definitely a part of, we're changing the focus so much from how am I burned out to what does it actually look like and feel like to achieve thriving. And so we created this metric for humanity where we really look at what does it feel like and look like to thriving? How does it look like and feel like to bounce back? And so if you look at the bottom of the slide, burnout at its core is really the impaired ability to experience positive emotion. And so if we're wanting to focus on what is my team culture like to thrive, what is my individual thriving like, and what does a system thriving look like, it's really culture at its core is the cultivation of positive emotions. So the foundation of really looking at a collective ability to access positive emotions. What emotions should we really be talking about? So joy, hope, gratitude, inspiration, awe, interest, amusement, pride, serenity, love. Access to all of these emotions in small, frequent doses throughout our day can act as tiny little engines in our brains throughout the day to really keep us going. And things like, I have gratitude for my coworker for helping me with a small task, or I have love for this patient that really came in and adhered to some advice that I gave them last time that I saw them, or I had a moment of laughter and amusement with a coworker over a situation that we connected with. All of these tiny moments of positive emotions can have undoing effects when we perhaps have a stressful day. Science has proven and has stated that access to these emotions throughout the day can really have an undoing effect to those stressful moments. So it's really important that we as leaders in healthcare can really cultivate these positive emotions throughout our day. When you think about well-being and outstanding performance, it can be a team sport. There's science to prove that 26% of our burnout is predicted by the people around us. So when we're working in teams, in organizations, the people that are around us have an impact on us. So if we flip that, if people around us have access to positive emotions, we're also going to have access to that positivity as well. So when we think about an organizational template for excellence, it becomes our collective accessibility to positive emotions. And how powerful can that be to work in an environment where we're all feeling a sense of peak performance in our day-to-day environment. And so how do we address these challenges? I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Maples to talk about how we might address that.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jennifer. So 3 questions in terms of how do we address it. First of all, we need to have our healthcare leaders and our team members really understand what's at risk if we don't get this right. What is the business performance case, the negative as well as the positive, by moving from exhaustion to thriving? Secondly, we need to redesign our traditional measurements of burnout. We're quite good at really looking at many things in medicine about how bad we're doing, how much we're in the hole, how much we're burnt out. But we really need to help understand how close we are to that thriving, and with those measurements, can we actually link solutions to actually get us to that point of thriving? And then lastly, we need to develop this comprehensive solutions blueprint, which will lead to meaningful and sustainable change. Next slide. To do that, the National Task Force developed a 5-step process. The first is to measure thriving, emotional recovery, and emotional exhaustion to understand where an individual, team, organization is as they begin this journey, and to help us map those solutions based on these metrics. Through the help of Dr. Sexton at Duke University and Marcus Buckingham, we were able to develop a validated survey to measure thriving, recovery, and recovery. Second, this issue of leadership. How do we lead in a human-centered way? How do we create an environment that helps our team members thrive? How do we create an environment that builds on strengths of individuals so that they can achieve peak performance? Critical in terms of how we lead. Third, how do we help our team members create an environment of psychological safety, an environment of trust and respect? And that's at every single interaction, from patient, physician, patient, nurse, physician, nurse, 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 etc. How do we give them the skills to create a different daily work environment? Next, experience mapping, looking at our key processes and amplifying joys and minimizing hassles of our daily work to help us go home with that good tired. And then last, a step that's often missed in most improvement work is the design session, looking at human-centered design principles where we hardwire everything we've learned from leadership, teamwork, and the experience mapping into a new way of how we execute our daily work to amplify joys, minimize hassles, and connect frequently in small doses to positive emotions. And then obviously we remeasure. I'm just going to give you a highlight of each of those steps to put a little meat to the topic. Next slide. So step 1 is the measurement, where we quantify thriving, recovery, and as well as emotional exhaustion with electronic surveys. But we also couple that with interviews and direct observations to understand the joys and the hassles of daily work and truly get the perspectives of the team. Next slide. I'm going to share an example of a urology clinic at an organization. This was their before their pre-measurement, before we did any work with them. And you can see that they were performing in the lower decile in terms of the ability to thrive. This came as a surprise to the leaders of this unit. They thought they were functioning quite well, but it also allowed us to map solutions to help them improve their thriving. Next slide. Their baseline ability to recover was also in the lower 10 percentile, the ability to bounce back, to really accept things that are not in your control, at least immediately in your control. Next slide. And their emotional exhaustion or burnout was actually in the upper third compared to this 1,000 plus work setting database. Next slide. Their team culture climate results showed significant opportunities. We're in this together, 26% strongly agreed. You can read the different metrics here, treating with respect, caring about me as a person, etc. So multiple opportunities as we began the work with the urology clinic. Next slide. Step 2 involves working with leadership to create a human-centered environment, an environment which builds on strengths of your team members so that they can use their strengths to achieve the goals that we aspire. How do we actually give feedback? We don't even like to call it feedback. We call feed forward to build on those strengths. How do we create an environment that taps into positive emotions frequently in small doses? There are many different things that can be done to achieve that. And as you can see on the right, this step predominantly is trying to influence the culture as we attempt to achieve that peak performance and the continuous improvement. Next slide. Step 3 is really focused on the team members, physicians, nurses, and caregiver team, giving them skills to really also connect to positive emotions, to change the question from what's the matter with you to what matters most, both to the patient as well as to each other. How do we show up as a team, create the respect, the trust, and the psychological safety? And there are a set of skills to really help drive that, again, culture in this a step of the work. Next slide. Step 4 looks at key processes within, in this case, the urology department, but whatever department we're working with. And we look at workflow observations, and then we identify opportunities to amplify joys, minimize hassles, create efficiencies. And this step actually will look at processes, technology, as well as the culture within the unit. And then step 5 is the human-centered design, where we hardwire everything that we've learned into the daily workflow, again, to maximize the joys, minimize the hassles of our daily work, make certain we're choosing the right technology, and at every moment of every day, looking at ways to tap into those positive emotions. Next slide.
I'm going to share a video.
Okay, so I'd like to share some reflections from one of the physicians that participated in this work at the institution that I showed you the baseline results, and then we'll show you some follow-up results. You can show the video, Jennifer.
I have to give you a sense as to where we were before all this started about a year ago. I think we really prided ourselves on being a practice that was highly efficient and highly effective. We worked and leaned really hard into the concept of standard work. And what that did is it made us a well-oiled machine, but for no purpose other than being a well-oiled machine. And when we really started to look at what human-centered leadership looked like, we recognized that that well-oiled machine was an entire team of folks who were being burned to the ground for the sake of efficiency. And one of the things we recognized is that, yes, those efficiencies were incredibly important, but not for the sake of efficiency, for the sake of space to create human connection with our staff, with our patients. And so when we really started to look at what that meant and how to create and take that space for human value, it really changed the dynamic. We recognized that, you know, as leaders, we had to start with ourselves. I was incredibly burnt out at the time. And that we recognized that the burnout we were carrying was spewing across to our entire team. And so really working on the skills of using the space to create space for emotion, for connection. Some of the ways we did that were really deep ways, and some of them were really silly ways. One of the things you recognize is that often the secondary of emotion of anger is what you see. And if you don't give space to people to really get to and understand what primary emotion was driving that, all you get is just a bunch of mad folks. You know, some of the deeper ways we created that was really making touch points where we even did reflections on, you know, we had a really bad day yesterday. I want you to talk about what that feels like. I want to share some reflections on how hard it was for me. I think often as physicians, we fail to be honest about how hard things were, about how painful things were, and that sets our team up for some unrealistic expectation that they can't express those things. When we took all of that space and filled it with valuable human emotion and connection, we created a team culture that was unlike anything I'd ever seen. I cannot tell you the value in the relationships, the support, the stability. And we were able to reflect about 6 months later, you know, you arrive at a place and sometimes you don't realize it until you've been there a while. Back in December, I sat down with my medical director, John Holly, and we talked about what our office looked like. And in that moment, I realized that we got there. I didn't know we were there until that point, but to look at your colleagues, to look at your team members and recognize that they're thriving in total chaos is a really beautiful thing.
So with those reflections, you might ask, what can you expect if you engage in work like this? I just thought I would share with you some results that looking at the effect on burnout, emotional recovery, looking at the team climate, the engagement, the turnover, the leadership skills, what happens to patient experience, what happens to patient safety and efficiency. Next slide. This is a slide looking at engagement at an institution where they had incredible difficulty moving their engagement scores to the point where they were almost ready to give up on the efforts and all of the best practice solutions. When they actually moved to a strengths-based approach, working on things and building on strengths of their individual team members, you can see what happened to the engagement over time. A very different organization. Next slide. Going back to our urology clinic and looking at their emotional exhaustion before they began this 5-step process, that's the line on the right, they moved all the way over to the left to an incredible 0% burnout. That's not what we typically see with the organizations and institutions. We see a great improvement, statistically significant improvement here. But this was quite dramatic. Next slide. When we look at the thriving, you can see, again, this urology clinic started in the lower decile, and at the end of the work, they improved to the upper third in terms of performance, again, statistically significant improvement. Next slide. The ability to recover for this unit went from lower decile to top decile performance, the ability to bounce back, to recover when things that seem to be out of your hands, to maintain a positive attitude. Next slide. If you look at the team climate, you can see rather significant improvements in all of the parameters, but the people that I work with care about me as a person. We have each other's back. I feel supported, etc. I feel connected to the mission. A very different team providing care to patients that I'm sure the patients can actually feel the difference as they receive their care on a daily basis. Next slide. When you look at moving those Hcap scores, that seems to be an impossible task for most organizations to achieve. This is a Michigan hospital that struggled for years, and when they began the work on the left-hand side of the curve, you can see this significant improvement in communication with nurses, doctors, as well as the overall global rating and the sustainment of that gain. Next slide. This looks at grievances. Grievances is a surrogate in terms of measuring what's happening to your culture. People complain when they're not happy with their experience. You can see at the red arrow there where when they launched this work, their grievances decreased by 60%. And the conservative estimate was that this not only was the better word of mouth for this organization, but also $1.6 million per year in savings, not having to manage the grievances directly. Next slide. When you look at turnover, the National Task Force and others estimate that the cost of nurse turnover due to burnout is $9 billion a year. And similarly, the cost for physician turnover due to burnout is about $3.5 billion a year. Stanford University Children's Health looked at one department and looked at the cost of turnover associated with burnout, and they estimated within their one department the savings up to $56 million a year. Next slide. And last, mortality. I mentioned that earlier. This is a health system in North Carolina. The red line is set at top 16% mortality. You can see that this organization drove their mortality to top decile performance. But more importantly, when you get this culture right, when you get people to a point of thriving and peak performance, more than 500 people left the hospital in 2014 compared to 2010 when this analysis was done, than would have left earlier before this work was launched. That's heartwarming and humbling to see the impact, and also daunting when you think about the responsibility that we have to actually get this right. Next slide. So again, I want to express our gratitude to the American Hospital Association, to Vocera, and to the Institute for supporting the work. Next slide. If you have any questions, you're interested in joining the journey, wanting to learn more, contact Jennifer Krippner. Would be happy to partner with you. And with that, be delighted to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Terrific presentation, Dr. William Maples and Jennifer. I even changed my background in your honor, from home to culture. There's so many, short liners on culture, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast, and every other initiative you have is just a side dish. And culture as the ultimate competitive advantage for any organization in any industry. And what you have here is real evidence on those impacts, and that's terrific. So I'll start with some questions here from the audience. We have just a couple minutes, so I'll pick a few of them. And the first one that we have here is on from William Fuller. Please discuss the impact of continuing support for staff reductions on both patients and organizational satisfaction. So of course, you're dealing with these forces that are contrary perhaps to creating this environment of harmony and trust, where there's so much pressure on the system. And on William's perspective here, this push for staff reductions. How do you balance all of this and so many other forces they're acting against maybe the direction that you're trying to take?
I'll start with that, Jennifer. It's a great question, and I've not been in a healthcare organization where there isn't this constant tension about, gee, if we had more people, it would all be better. We need more people, and then the administration trying to balance the bottom line in terms of keeping financial viability. And so I think when you get to a critical mass and you don't have enough individuals to execute the work, you clearly are going to have trouble reaching peak performance. On the other hand, there are many times where I've seen it being on both sides of the equation, where you can actually do the solutions and the interventions that we talked about, and even though you may feel that you're short-staffed on things, you can see a tremendous improvement in the work environment, the culture, and with that, you can drive efficiency to the point where you may not be feeling the pain that you thought you were feeling before. So it's a delicate balance. I don't mean to minimize this, but a lot of times we end up on two real polar opposites, where one side says we can't possibly do anything with this, and the other way is say, no, you can do it with it, just get this right. I think coming in the middle and really working on both things together is the key here.
Very well. Another question, the questions that have emerged during your presentation have to do with the current state of healthcare, and of course, the perception and the reality, because we have a lot of practitioners who are in the audience as well, is that the burnout has increased as a result of COVID-19, and especially those who are directly dealing with that. How can organizations kind of be able to see beyond this current situation, and maybe how to deal with this current situation in the context of burnout with a global pandemic taking place? Any suggestions related to that?
Jennifer?
Yeah, I think that we found a couple interesting facts during this pandemic, is that we've seen this rallying of teams coming together and finding this common purpose with each other, which kind of brings us back together in a sense of resiliency, of finding this common bond of we're all in this together, we're coming together. So it's kind of created this sense of teamwork, in a sense of wanting to do the right thing and rallying together. So I think the sense of teamwork and peak performance for a common goal has helped. And yet at the other end of the spectrum is we're all working really hard and long, and the burnout obviously now 6 months into the pandemic is really wearing on everybody. So looking to what kind of skills and access to those emotions of when we are working together as a team is more important now than ever, to find ways to build those relationships and draw on those strengths. Dr. Maples, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I think I just have to say that as we've talked with organizations walking through the pandemic, one comment that comes up frequently and just resonates with me is that finally my leadership has actually listened to me. Mm-hmm. Finally, they understand, and we're working together. So what Jennifer said is, now is the time to capitalize on some of the gains that we've made and really intentionally hardwire, the skills that I introduced in the 5 steps to become more routine rather than just during a time of stress for the organization. Now more than ever, it's necessary to build that back up to achieve the thriving and the ability to recover.
Terrific way to wrap up the session and message to all of us. Dr. William Maples and Jennifer Krippner, thank you so much for your leadership, for leading such a critical, important initiative for healthcare, but so for society as a whole. Grateful for your time to be here with us, sharing your journey, And there will be many of us who will be in touch with you to find ways that we can collaborate and support your mission going forward. Thanks for your leadership.
Thanks, Jose. We really appreciate the opportunity to share our story with you.
Yes, thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, wonderful presentation from Dr. William Maples and Jennifer Krippner about the importance of building a culture where collaboration, innovation, and really he talked about positive emotions thrive. We had an entire conference on cultural transformation that many of you participated a few weeks back. And this is a great demonstration and with measurable results about the importance of culture. And culture is the ultimate competitive advantage for any organization. And a great example and demonstration of this mission that they're on with the Institute for Healthcare Excellence. Terrific. We're going to wrap up the segment. At the top of the hour, we're going to shift. We're going to bring experts in healthcare who are looking at implementation of technology for improvements and innovations in their organizations. So we're going to have representatives from Change Healthcare, HCA Healthcare, and Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina on a panel discussion with technology expertise related to robotics process automation and how they're scaling robotics process automation in healthcare. So you do not want to miss that. We'll see you back at the top of the hour. Thank you.